Hi, I'm Raissa Bretana and I'm a fashion historian and an adjunct instructor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where I teach a course on the history of costume and fashion in film. Today we're going to review some iconic fashion scenes in film and TV.
I'm sorry, I'm terribly nervous. I've never done anything like this.
Nothing to be nervous about. You're going to be great. Now listen close. You're in Paris.
This is Funny Face, directed by Stanley Donen, with costumes by Edith Head and Hubert de Givenchy. This scene features a photo shoot montage in different locations in Paris. And here we really see true Givenchy on display.
That's great. Stop! Wonderful!
For starters, the photographer Dick Avery, played by Fred Astaire, is actually based on the real-life fashion photographer Richard Avedon. And Avedon actually collaborated on this film. He shot the entire title sequence, and all of those stills that we see throughout this photo shoot sequence were actually shot by Avedon himself.
The house shows the collection on Friday. The night before, I'm giving a party to introduce you to the press.
The editor-in-chief of the fictional Quality magazine in this film is based on a real-life fashion figure, and that is the iconic Diana Vreeland. In the 1950s, she was an editor at Harper's Bazaar, but she would later go on to become the editor-in-chief of Vogue. All of the clothes that we see Audrey wearing in this photo shoot sequence and in any scene that takes place in a fashion setting in Paris can be attributed to Hubert de Givenchy.
I know. I'm a princess at a ball, and the bird is really Prince Charming.
This film is a love letter to the golden age of couture, but also to Paris, the capital of fashion. And we actually see in imagery from the 1950s that many fashion photographers positioned their models against the backdrop of iconic Paris landscapes to really hit home that this was the home of fashion. This was the center of the fashion world. This is American Crime Story, The Assassination of Gianni Versace, created by Ryan Murphy. Directed by Gwyneth Horder Payton, with costume design by the great Lou Eyrich and Allison Leach. In this scene, Donatella wears the dress that made her a star. This scene takes place in 1992 at the 100th anniversary party of Vogue. So Gianni really wanted Donatella to make a splash, and she did.
Gianni, Donatella, over here.
You can see in this scene that he is holding her hand at the beginning of this red carpet moment, but by the end of the scene, he's let go and she's standing on her own. And that is rather symbolic about this passing of the torch in the legacy of Versace. This dress came from Versace's fall 1992 collection called Miss S&M, but now it's more commonly referred to as the Bondage collection, and it's considered one of his most memorable collections. This is pretty much an exact recreation of the dress that Donatella wore in real life. Gianni Versace really loved to shock people, and he designed another dress a few years later that became known as That Dress, with the gold safety pins that was famously worn by Elizabeth Hurley. In the early 1990s, fashion designers became celebrities in themselves, and Donatella was actually rather shy. So making this big splashy debut in this dress really positioned her well to take over the brand after her brother's death. Donatella often pays homage to her brother Gianni's work in her more recent collections, which did feature a resurrection of this bondage dress. This is Coco before Chanel, directed by Anne Fontaine, with costumes by Catherine Leterrier. This is the final scene of the film where we really see the scope of Chanel's legacy. The scene kind of takes place outside of time. When it begins, we see her wearing the quintessential Chanel look of the 1930s with that short waved hair, the long sleeve black dress, and the long pearl necklaces. So we think that we're kind of moving through the 1930s, but then we start to see a few models that are wearing more contemporary pieces, and you kind of understand that this is in some sort of timeless fantasy space. As the models start coming down that staircase, we see that Chanel adds that white tweed jacket. And this is another signature aspect of the Chanel style that comes around when she makes her comeback in 1954. So that moves us even further along on her timeline. As we can see in the looks that are being shown during this fashion show, part of the Chanel look is this really, really clean color palette, just black and white. And it's said that this was inspired by her upbringing when she was basically an orphan at a convent, and she was surrounded by these nuns and developed a taste for this austerity. You can see in the reflection that the audience is actually a contemporary audience. We can really see that the scene is an homage to the timelessness of the Chanel style, because if they're mixing the looks from all these different periods and creating a seamless aesthetic, it really is a testament to the strength of the Chanel legacy. These are actual true Chanel garments that were on loan from the Chanel Conservatory. And this scene was actually shot at the House of Chanel at the 31 Rue Cambon, where Chanel established herself as a couturier in 1918. So to shoot this scene in this historic location on those iconic stairs really helps to portray the Chanel legacy. This scene is from Yves Saint Laurent, directed by Jalil Lesper, with costumes by Madeleine Fontaine. In this scene, we see Yves Saint Laurent present his first collection under his own label in 1962.
Hello, Mrs. Snow, thank you very much.
So this is how a collection would have been presented during this time, just very exclusive industry players invited to a couture salon. So that is Victoire, his good friend and his first muse. She figures pretty prominently in the narrative. I love that you can see his lineup of looks, the drawings that are pinned to the wall there. This scene depicts a really important moment in the history of the brand of Yves Saint Laurent, because this is the very first collection that he produced under his own name. Yves Saint Laurent was considered a sort of fashion prodigy, and they called him the Little Prince of Fashion, because at a very young age, he was 21 years old when he took over the most prestigious fashion house in Paris. Dior died very suddenly in 1957, and his young assistant was suddenly promoted to be the head of this international brand. In this show, we actually get to see a collection that is quintessentially Saint Laurent, that he's designing for himself and no longer under the name of Dior. So you can tell that the clothes are a lot more youthful, they're a lot freer, and this is the designer that he wanted to be all along. It would have been near impossible to replicate the clothing from this original collection to do it justice. So it's very interesting to note that these are the clothes from the original collection, and that is almost unheard of when it comes to movie costuming. The filmmakers actually collaborated with Pierre Berger, who was Yves Saint Laurent's longtime partner and the head of the foundation of Yves Saint Laurent. And he plays a leading character in this film, and he was very involved in the filmmaking process. The foundation of Yves Saint Laurent actually lent 77 pieces from their archives for this shoot. So these clothes that we're seeing in this scene are original from 1962. These clothes are understandably kept under museum conditions for most of the time. They had conservators on set with their white gloves, ready to handle these at any moment during shooting. Another precaution that was taken is that the models are actually wearing special underwear so that none of the clothes are actually touching their skin. They obviously couldn't alter these original garments, and they had to cast models to fit the clothes. So kind of the backwards way of doing couture. This is Sabrina from 1954, directed by Billy Wilder, with costumes by Edith Head and Hubert de Givenchy.
As the chairman of the board, I would like to say at the outset, the chairman is so dizzy.
In this scene, Audrey Hepburn visits Humphrey Bogart in his office wearing a little black cocktail dress.
Meeting adjourned. Have a frozen daiquiri.
I once saw an office like this in an old copy of Fortune magazine.
This is quintessential Givenchy, quintessential mid-century couture. The most striking feature of this dress is that very high neckline that was used to cover Audrey's collarbone. And we also see that it comes to a deep V in the back. So this neckline was called a bateau neckline, but eventually became referred to as a Sabrina neckline. Givenchy really thrived under the tutelage of another great couturier, Cristobal Balenciaga, and Balenciaga loved to create a lower neckline in the back. So you can see a little bit of that influence there. When people think of Audrey Hepburn and a little black dress, their minds usually go straight to Breakfast at Tiffany's. But it was this film that gave birth to the famed partnership between Audrey Hepburn and Hubert de Givenchy.
You see the French line pier?
Yes?
She does wear a funny little cocktail hat, which would have been common for this time period. And when you talk about what makes a hat a cocktail hat, it's usually an element of whimsy, which this hat definitely has.
Yes, I am.
This dress is so memorable in the perception of Parisian couture during the 1950s that Givenchy is often credited as the creator of the little black dress, but that is an honor that does belong to Coco Chanel, who debuted the style in Vogue in 1926. This is Ocean's 8, directed by Gary Ross, with costumes by Sarah Edwards. In this scene, the filmmakers recreate fashion's favorite night out, the Met Gala.
Edward, so good to see you.
Nice
Claude
to see you.
Becker.
Pleasure.
And of course, Rose Lyle.
Yes.
You two know each other.
Yes.
Yes.
So the entire plot of this film surrounds one night, and it's the biggest night in fashion. They actually used the setup from the Met Gala, so the stairs, the location, very accurate. Helena Bonham Carter plays the fictional designer Rose Weil, who isn't really based on a real designer, but I'm definitely getting Vivienne Westwood vibes off of this look. So it would be typical for a designer to walk the red carpet with one of the celebrities that is representing them, and this is the way the Met Gala works. That designers are basically given the task of putting together a team of stars to represent them and to wear their work on the red carpet.
Pleasure.
And of course, Rose Lyle.
The costumes worn by our 8 leading ladies are actually designer clothes attributed to different designers. So Anne Hathaway is wearing Valentino, Sandra Bullock is wearing Alberta Ferretti, Helena Bonham Carter is wearing Dolce & Gabbana, and we see Rihanna wearing Zac Posen.
Music.
This is The Women from 1939, directed by George Cukor, with costumes by Adrian. In this scene, we see a fashion show that takes place at a New York couture house. This is an incredibly pivotal scene in fashion history, and it's remarkable because it is a Technicolor scene that's kind of inserted into a black and white film. Just to be clear, this is not what fashion shows look like. This is what Hollywood thought fashion shows looked like. Adrian was able to develop a signature style during his time at MGM, and this style he would actually use to open his own couture house in 1941. And The Women, which was released in 1939, was really his swan song, and you really see him flex all of his creative muscles in this fashion show. In this scene, and also in similar scenes in other films during this era, there were a lot of them, we see that we don't necessarily get the true Paris couture, but rather Hollywood's version of Paris couture. So everything's kind of a little shinier and a little larger in scale, but that's Hollywood. And just because Hollywood costume designers were developing their own unique style doesn't mean they didn't have one eye on what was happening in Paris. We can see elements of surrealist design throughout this fashion show, and those can be attributed to the Paris couturier Elsa Schiaparelli. The first one is that kind of unusual hand-shaped clasp on that swim cover-up, but also we see surrealist elements in the final segment of the fashion show, namely in those aqua-colored gloves that has these kind of odd light bulb shaped elements attached to them. The name Adrian was synonymous with Hollywood glamour, but there are certain elements of design that really say Adrian more than anything else. And those would be very, very prominent shoulders, as well as elements like the dolman sleeve. In watching these films and breaking down the costumes, we can see that there has historically been a symbiotic relationship between fashion and film. Doubtless, these two art forms will continue to influence and inspire each other, and my hope is we will have a lot more fashion looks to break down in the future.